In Russian, there is a single word for the concept of teaching and learning, Obuchenie. In their book, Scaffolding Literacy Instruction, Adrian and Emily Rogers explain that until the 1970s, there was no English equivalent to Obuchenie, perhaps because up until then we had not identified such a process. Instead, in research and in practice, teaching and learning were viewed as separate processes. We had theories about teaching, and in the classroom we taught and then tested learning. They continue by suggesting that in the mid-1970s a new perspective emerged. Around that time, studies of interactions between parents and children began to flourish, and Western researchers became familiar with Vygotsky's theory of learning and the notion of a zone of proximal development. In these parent-child studies, researchers observed a different kind of process, one in which teaching and learning is intertwined. We see these types of parent-child interactions all the time in everyday life. In all these examples, the parent, who is the teacher, seems to be operating from the question, what can my child accomplish with assistance? We're not surprised when we see these interactions because we expect them between parents and children. In 1976, David Wood, Jerome Bruner, and Gail Ross famously described these helpful interactions between parent and child as scaffolding, coining a term they define as a process that enables a child or novice to solve a task or achieve a goal that would be beyond his unassisted efforts. The analogy of a scaffold is a useful one because it describes the process by which a teacher and a child interact as the child moves toward independence. The scaffold is only temporary and is removed when the work is finished. It can be put together and taken down quickly as the need for assistance arises. Jeffrey Wilhelm and his colleagues offer this visual representation of scaffolding when applied to best practices of a balanced literacy program. In the column to the far left, Read Aloud is included as an example of a teacher-regulated activity. At the bottom of the column, Dr. Wilhelm has labeled teacher-regulated activities as I do, you watch, which aligns with the demonstration phase of Don Holdaway's learning model. I do, you watch is an easy reminder of what a read-aloud activity looks and sounds like. The far right column under the student-regulated heading includes independent reading. Dr. Wilhelm describes independent reading as a you do, I watch activity, which Holdaway might refer to as performance. The section in the middle includes activities that fall into the supportive joint practice category. This is where shared reading and guided reading are found. Shared reading is described as I do, you help, and guided reading releases even more responsibility and becomes you do, I help. These two components provide just the right amount of scaffolding to move students through a gradual release of responsibility toward independence. In this picture, the father and son are engaged in a storytime activity, and their behaviors help us visualize what is described in the last slide. If the father is reading to his little boy, then scaffolding is at the level of I do, you watch. However, if you look closely, the scenario may instead be that the child is attempting to turn the pages by himself. In that case, the dad has relinquished some control, invited his child to try turning some of the pages, and moved to I do, you help. These differences are subtle, but that precisely captures the incredibly important ability of teachers knowing when to step in or when to pull back. As soon as the new learning is under control, the teacher, whether at home or at school, ups the ante and the cycle begins again. On the lighter side, this amusing cartoon captures the likely outcome of learning when all the modes of scaffolding are not provided. The use of read-alouds, shared reading experiences, small group guided reading instruction, and a regularly scheduled independent reading time is supported by a strong body of research. Let's look briefly at the role each one has in scaffolding students' learning. In the read aloud portion of a lesson, the teacher demonstrates fluent reading and models strategies used by proficient readers. Using a think aloud conversation, the teacher shares strategies for figuring out words, improving comprehension, and understanding text of a slightly more complex nature. By listening to the teacher read, students have access to printed materials that may be beyond the student's independent or instructional reading levels. Students are exposed to a variety of genres and text structures that are a bit more complex than they could handle on their own. Of course, it is also okay for the students to simply delight in the read aloud with no strings attached. In shared reading, there is an expectation that the students will be actively participating in some way. The teacher models and teaches reading strategies while extending understanding of the reading process, and she invites the students to read along with her at selected places in the text. On the part of the teacher, the level of scaffolding has shifted to I do and you help. The text level must now be within a range that allows students to contribute, at least during the parts selected by the teacher. As the class joins in, a risk-free environment emerges where the more competent readers scaffold the others. Since students are interacting directly with the print, they must all be able to see the text. Teachers often use big books with large print, but any printed material will work as long as all the children can see well enough to read. Teacher-made posters and charts, sentence strips on pocket charts, and document projectors are all ways to make printed materials accessible to the whole group for shared reading. The critical understanding here that makes shared reading different from a read aloud is that all students must be able to see and follow along with the text. Shared reading activities also include settings where each student has a copy of the book or blackline master. This most often occurs with upper elementary students, when pointing to the print is no longer necessary by the teacher. With guided reading, the gradual release of responsibility is even more evident. The teacher moves to a you do, I help role and allows the students time and opportunity for practice. It is the student who now controls the book and practices the use of reading strategies. The teacher observes and is ready to help if a student begins to struggle. Through the use of running records and other assessments, she will anticipate processing strategies that the students may be neglecting and will plan to reinforce them throughout the session. Before and after reading, she will engage the students in discussions to ensure that getting meaning from text is clearly the most important reason for reading. By allocating time for independent reading, the teacher demonstrates the value for reading. The student selects the text and practices reading a book that can be read unassisted. At this time, the teacher is in a you do, I watch role and does not anticipate a need to interrupt their reading, even though she will keep a watchful eye on them from a distance. Don Holdaway would refer to this as performance because the students have reached a level of independence with a particular level of text and are comfortable reading on their own. Now there is a great goal. No, I don't mean bungee jumping. I mean avoiding bungee jumping as a teaching practice. Effective teaching should rarely, if ever, move from teacher demonstration directly to student performance without going through critical stages of practice with scaffolding from a more capable other. As you reflect on the scaffolding that supports learning, remember that jumping from I do, you watch all the way over to you do, I watch probably does not provide strong enough support to ensure that all students have a chance to be successful. As you continue this module, reflect on how Jeffrey Wilhelm's I do, you help and Don Holdaway's participation phase of learning can impact your teaching and ultimately provide a risk-free, supportive setting in which students learn to love reading as a lifelong tool.